So I'll start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting, the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Barwon peoples, and pay my respects to the elders, past and present. I'm Liz Hicks, a lecturer here at the law school and a member of the Centre of Comparative Constitutional Studies. And I'm delighted to be chairing this conversation between Pavel Chikov and Associate Professor Will Partlett. Pavel is one of Russia's leading human rights lawyers, and it's a real honour to have him share his thoughts today on the possibilities and challenges of human rights protection in the Russian context. These lessons obviously have a lot of salience beyond the Russian context as well. In 2023, Pavel was awarded the OSCE Democracy Defender Award for his legal work protecting journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society activists in Russia. In 2014, he received the prestigious Rafter Prize for his work defending the rule of law. Will Partlett, as we all know, is an associate professor here at the Centre and is our resident Russia expert, as well as a historian and a comparative public law expert. Will's research looks at the role of constitutional structure in ensuring democratic governance, as well as the dangers of centralisation. Will's most recent book, which I have here, Why the Russian Constitution Matters, really demonstrates how these research interests come together. It explores how Vladimir Putin has exploited executive powers to centralise power in the president, what the book describes as the constitutional dark arts. And the book shows the lessons that this offers for democracies and for states generally, themes that Will and Pavel will no doubt cover today. So we're going to start with a 50-minute to hour conversation between Will and Pavel. At 6:40, we'll allow for 20 minutes of Q&A and we'll take questions. So I'll pass over to Will to start.
Thanks, Liz. And thank you guys all for coming. Today, what we're going to do is have a discussion. And the idea of this is that, a discussion between Pavel and myself, and in some ways, obviously I'm an outsider to the Russian experience. So I look at Russia as someone who has been studying Russia for over 20 years, but is really as an outsider, right? Someone who was not born there, who has a family there, but has been interested in and studied it from that perspective. So I'm interested. And so looking at Russia as, for its own sake, because as we're going to talk about today, Russia is one of the most misunderstood places in the world, I think. Lots of myths and misconceptions about Russia. But also Russia, as we're going to talk about today, also has a lot of lessons, I think, for the world now, both bad and good, I think, right? We're going to talk about the dark arts, but we're going to talk about the defense against the dark arts. So that's going to be my perspective. And of course, Pavel's perspective is going to be as someone who's an insider, someone who for 20, 25 years has been involved in actual human rights protection in Russia, continues to be involved in that. So, and has a lot of insight about, the things that we're going to be talking about, the things that I talk about in my book and think about. So you really have a dialogue between an insider-outsider perspective, hopefully is going to really draw out some of these insights that we can then discuss in the Q&A, because I think I do want us to all think about that. And what Pavel and I have done is we've had a few conversations since he got off the plane on Monday, and we're going to organize it into a kind of series of thematic things, or thematic kind of themes that actually help us understand both Russia, but also themes that are important more broadly in understanding all kinds of questions. So understanding questions of the relationship between law and authoritarianism, how law is used in authoritarian regimes, both by the dictator or the elites, but also by human rights, right? Because the law can be used both ways. And I think thinking about it in those two different ways, I think is quite important. So we'll be thinking about these in these different themes, and of course we can then. So if you think of something as we're talking questions, write it down, and then we can work it through in the Q&A. Okay, so hopefully this is going to work. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about. This is a picture of Andrei Sakharov, probably the best known of the Russian dissidents from the Soviet period. Andrei Sakharov is probably best known for being the father of the Soviet atomic bomb, as well as later in his career receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1975 for his work on human rights. And in Russian, pravozashitniki is the Russian term, rights defenders. He becomes one of the leaders of the rights defending community, which in many cases are these elite dissident intellectuals in Russia, intelligentsia, who are interested in a different type of Russia, different type of Soviet Union operating in the Soviet context. And for our purposes, the reason why I put a picture of him up in this context is to discuss one of the kind of enduring legacies of the ideas of the dissidents is a form of what I call anti-politics or depoliticization. And we can see this very clearly in Andrei Sakharov himself had drafted a constitutional text, which was widely circulated in the late 1980s. When does he die? In 89? 89. So it's widely circulated and actually remarkably has significant influence on what ultimately is adopted in 1993. It is a very interesting text, constitutional text to read from a perspective of constitutional law. And I'll just say a few things about what do I mean by anti-politics or depoliticized form of democracy. Well, at the very center of Sakharov's vision of a democratic, what he calls a democratic constitutional system, or a new Soviet, or a better Soviet Union, which would be democratic, are human rights. There's a long list of human rights protections. There's a focus on the importance of courts, both domestic and international, in enforcing those rights. And that the idea here is that this revamped new constitutional state will create is a kind of utopia of rights protection, with judges ultimately protecting individuals through court proceedings. What's really striking about this constitution is how little attention it pays to the organization of the state, the distribution of power between institutions, right? Something that we think constitutions have done for, if we think of the idea of constitution in the British tradition, for instance, on unwritten tradition, we always think the constitution at basis is the organization of institutions. How does the executive relate to parliament, to the courts, to the other institutions, and so forth? So it's a really interesting example of a kind of an intellectual and constitutional project driven by an appeal to rights, to universal rights, but very little attention played to the state. To the extent to which there is a state, he creates an elected president who cannot, according to the Constitution, be a member of a political party. So that is an apolitical elected president with some kind of legislative body. But again, not a lot of effort put into that. In some ways, I think he just wasn't in his movement, right? Sakharov is emblematic of this overall dissident movement, is one that is not as interested in the state, right? You're not interested in organizing the state, thinking about the distribution of power. Now, that all might sound really high-minded and good, but there are some problems with this, I think. And one of them is the blind spots. In particular, blind spot it has is that, and this is a quote from the book itself, that the rights defenders, pravozащитники, the Sakharov and his peoples, and an important player in this is an individual named Sergei Kovalev, who becomes a close advisor to Yeltsin in the period when Yeltsin establishes the constitutional system, is that the rights defenders are not therefore interested really in confronting the long tradition in Russia of state centralization, right? By proposing a constitution that distributes power, allocates power between different sites, and that actually channels disagreement through institutional arrangements, right? They're not interested in that project. And in some cases, because they're not really interested in how the state's organized as much as they're saying, look, what we want to do is instead create a kind of, in some ways, almost a technocratic legal state, right? Which will ultimately, and if you read the Constitution, and we talk about kind of what someone like Samuel Moyn calls the last utopia, there's some really utopian ideas in there. The Constitution actually says at the end it wants to ultimately lead into a world government, right? So there's a real utopian context here. And one of the I think enduring ideas of this kind of anti-politics does continue to play a role even to this day in Russia, this kind of anti-politics, and to some extent has had negative impacts on and helped to enable at least some of what we've seen and the lack of attention to the organization of the state and the normative importance of structures, right, and getting structures right, and thinking of democracy as not purely a system of rights protection, but more fundamentally a system of organized structures. Okay, so that's kind of what I write about in the book, and what I'm going to talk forever about this, but I want to hand over to Pavel to talk about because you've had a look at the book, you've thought about this. Like, what are your reactions to this idea of anti-politics and its influence in Russia then and through to today?
Thank you, Will. Good afternoon. Well, yes, I am a human rights lawyer, and I started my work in 1999 when I was a student in the law school back home in Kazan, Russia. And there was a human rights movement in Russia started in late 70s then, and the starting point was the Helsinki Agreement of 1975, and the main idea was that the West was trying, the Soviet Union was trying to sell oil and gas to the West because the prices were really high that time of these natural resources, and the Soviet Union was trying to sell to gain currency inside the country because there were troubles economically in the Soviet Union that time. And at the same time, the West wanted to enforce democratic values and human rights. And to Brezhnev that time, to the head of the Soviet Union, it was okay to take these obligations because they were sure that they can ignore them. There was no control over human rights implementation in the country, and that allowed human rights groups to stand up and to say that we were going to control how the Soviet Union fulfills its obligation in human rights. So that was the cornerstone and the starting point of the whole human rights movement in Russia. And Sakharov was one of those, being a physicist, and he was he was inspired about that idea, and one of the reasons I think he was against this political party stuff, because the ruling role of the Communist Party was written in the Soviet Constitution, and that was one of the things he was trying to attack, to exclude this article from the Soviet Constitution. This is actually what still is in the Chinese legal system, right? Because China has this ruling role of the Communist Party still. And I think that being not political, not involved into this political party thing was one of the reasons. And I was surprised reading the book, actually, how big was the influence of human rights idea and human rights defenders on Yeltsin and new Russia democratic states, the elites. Because I knew Sergei Sergei Kovalев personally. He was the closest friend to Sakharov, and he was one of the co-founders of Memorial, which was the one of the leading human rights, and still is one of the leading human rights organizations in Russia, started from the Soviet times. And Kovalев was the federal ombudsman to Yeltsin, and he was in that position till the first Chechen war in 1995. I think it was 1995 when he decided to step down because of the gross human rights violations committed by the federal government in Chechnya. So that was another influential movement of from the human rights side. That time was the soldiers' mothers who, because of the Afghanistan war, it's like similar to a certain extent to what's going on right now because of the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. But a little bit still different because there was a lot of opposition uh, uh, to Soviet to young boys going forcibly sent to Afghanistan for that war, and their mothers were united to organize a huge human rights movement. So what I'm saying is that in late 80s and early 90s, the human rights movement was extremely influential, and it had certain results in even in the constitution. So that's why we're talking about it.
And Yeltsin picks up on that, right? And
Yes.
is able to pick up on that.
And the
And
West was behind that, so it was a huge pressure on the federal government, first federal government in Russia in the early 90s.
and what I would call one of the tragedies of the Russian transition, not just the Russian, a lot of the other post-Soviet republics, is that the tragedies is that this was seen as a constitution that defended had a lot of rights provisions in it, and a strong constitutional court was seen as enough, right, to really to build democracy. And the blind spot, which comes from, understandably, I mean, I'm not condemning Andrei Sakharov or Sergei Kovalev and others. I mean, Sergei Kovalev very extremely committed to the rights, but they support what we're going to talk about in a moment, which is the creation of a highly centralized system of presidential domination. And I'll turn to that now. And this happens. This is the what are called the October events in 1993 in Russia, when Yeltsin seizes power. This is the elected legislature. This is what they at the time called the White House, the Белый дом, where the Congress of People's Deputies, Supreme Soviet, which was the kind of the form of this, was me. They were kind of camped out in here. There was a what looked like could potentially break into a civil war between these two, between the office of the president at that time, Boris Yeltsin, and this and the parliament, or this Congress of People's Deputies, like Supreme Soviet, ultimately is shelled, right, and the individuals in there are arrested. And I think within there, I mean, people died in this conflict. And what you get out of this is a constitution that you could almost think of as a kind of permanent crisis constitution. So Yeltsin seizes power essentially after the shelling of parliament without any. He's ruling as a dictator, right? At that stage, he dissolves the constitutional court, which had opposed him. The parliament has obviously been, they're all largely sitting in prison at the time. They're ultimately let out quite soon afterwards. But the idea is he's ruling as a dictator, and he pushes through a highly presidentially centered constitution. Now, again, that constitution has a lot of rights provisions in it. And there's a lot of focus at the time about the rights provisions in the constitutional court. But this permanent crisis kind of, document in which the president is determined as what's called the garant, the guarantor of the entire system, is a constitutional system that we're going to see just 7 years later, when Vladimir Putin comes in, is extremely useful to him, is as a tool to build what we see today. It's not to say that Putin hasn't used other mechanisms, but the Constitution really matters, and it's the Constitution that's created in this context, right? So there's both. So I think kind of the story is there's both ideas at play here, in the sense that that Yeltsin was able to, and it was understood more broadly and supported in the West as a democratic constitution because it had these rights provisions behind it, right? It had this constitutional court. But again, if you look to the later provisions where they organize state power, we see a much different set, and it's a kind of constitution in tension with itself, right? On one hand, a lot of rights provisions, a strong constitutional court, but on the other hand, a president, an office of the president that has almost near dictatorial powers if exercised to their hilt. At least that's the argument. Pavel, someone who, I mean, your experience, I mean, and your sense of this centralization, I mean, would you agree that the Russian constitution at the moment is a kind of permanent crisis constitution in that regard, and that it is, and that, ultimately it's up to the person, right? I mean, you have Yeltsin, who was committed. Yeltsin throughout the 90s was relatively committed to human rights, so he brings Russia into the Council of Europe. Putin, less committed to the liberal kind of project, is able to use the constitution. It's a highly it's a document that's really can be tailored by the individual in charge in a kind of almost permanent, in a crisis kind of context.
Well, there is, when you look at the events, and especially at the document of the Constitution, retrospectively, you may be deceived with the intentions behind the authors, because you have to keep in mind the conditions and the moment of that time. So in 1992, 93, then every year the situation in Russia was changing rapidly. And by that time, in mid 93, the Russian president, the Russian president was in this sandwich and pressure from different sides. The Soviet Union just dissolved, right? Dissolved, and there was a huge movement in some Russian regions to get more powers of self-determination. And I'm coming from Tatarstan, which is one of the most independent regions in the Russian Federation. And I remember that clearly myself. There was a moment. I can tell. Well, my mom is Tatar and my dad is Russian. And in early 90s, there was a Tatar nationalist movement in our region to kick off Russians from the region and to even to kill kids from the mixed families. And I remember how my parents were. Frightened about from this situation. And then there were a lot of talks that was kind of a propaganda from the federal state. But I remember in my how it was in my family, and so the risks of and there was a Chechen war later. It was later, but still, Chechnya by that time acted absolutely independently from the federal government. So trying to and there were no money in the budget that time. The only money coming were credits from the West, from the Western countries. So the government was traveling around asking for more money, for more credits from European countries and from the US. So and the elites were divided. So one part was the parliament, which was pretty Soviet style parliament. It was a permanent risk of the communists coming back because the Russian Communist Party was still there, and all the electorate was the voters were there. And actually, later events in 1996, for example, they show that the main threat for Yeltsin's team was from the Communist Party. So I'm not trying to justify what Yeltsin has done, but I just want to give you this understanding that here the task was to fix the crisis at the moment. And that was one of the reasons why they decided to create the superpower of presidency. But then we see what happened and how this has been misused by Putin and his circle.
Yes, we'll get to that. I mean, one of the things it's interesting to say here is to say this is one of the dilemmas of constitution making more broadly, is when you are making constitutions in times of crisis, how do you, and you genuinely, I think, there were one of the really tragic, maybe the second tragedy of the Russian Reformation process in the early 1990s, is there were lots of people on the street who really wanted democracy, right? That took to the street, millions of Russians on the streets, not just Russians, I mean, all around the former Soviet, in the republics as well. And the second tragedy is, as Pavel's saying, when you're faced with potentially the disintegration, because of course the Soviet Union disintegrates, dissolves, and then the next potential thing is that the Russia itself disintegrates. And the amount of, it's often not talked about, but when states disintegrate, and particularly in Central Asia, when the Central Asian republics, become independent, there's a war in Tajikistan where I think over 1 million people die. I mean, it's a very, very, so it leads to a lot of economic and a lot of, so it's, the disintegration of states can be very, very dislocation. And so how do you get constitutions that can ensure stable power, but then over time don't create the long-term impacts of centralization? So it's not a question that, there's some, I put out some answers in the book, maybe temporary constitutions, kind of constitutions that are time limited or so forth, but it's just a dilemma that, but it's more than, I think, just an academic and a historical dilemma. It's possible that not just in Russia, but in other parts of the world, when we see state collapse or the state is disintegrating, an attempt to try to build a democratic regime, how do you do that? So that's the kind of what we're learning here about centralization. How to, the kind of the permanent crisis. So what happens next? Well, we have in 2000 an unknown individual. This is the hand of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. This is the last. I think it's his 5th inauguration. 5 times. So it's just, he's aging. You can see his hand is aging there. But he, from the beginning, from taking power and being elected in 2000, starts to use the constitutional powers of the office quite aggressively to assert control, to co-opt and control what was in the 1990s somewhat of a pluralistic system. So the first thing he goes after is media. Right, he establishes control over NTV, which is one of the big television stations run by an oligarch named Buzinski, who's forced out of the country, flees to Israel. Berezovsky, another oligarch who controls another TV station, is also forced out. So he consolidates control over the media. He then consolidates control over the regional governors through essentially legal and constitutional changes, including setting up these vice polpredia, I don't even know how to translate that, like kind of these agents of the president, presidential representatives in the regions who can exercise control. And in some ways, what he's doing with those individuals is going to these governors and saying, look, I control the courts, because generally the central government can, and I will make sure that you will get prosecuted for all the stuff, because the 1990s was a relatively corrupt time, to put it mildly, in Russia, that there was threats of corruption unless they towed the line, and most of them did so. So it was a period where the constitutional system was centralized. And, obviously Putin now, with the exception of 4 years, has been in power ever since. And over time, he's been slowly consolidating control, using the Constitution and using law and using institutions. But this is also the time that Pavel is building a rights protection organization. So I want Pavel to talk about, even in a system like Russia is up to really till the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, from 2000 to 2022, 22 years of increasing presidential domination, law is still operating. And what we get is what Putin is creating is an early version of what we now call new forms of legalistic authoritarianism, right? Which we're seeing in places like Indonesia, India, Hungary, Turkey. The new form of authoritarianism now is not often, one-party states with Leninist kind of organizations and vanguard parties, but instead actually use institutions and elections and law, right? And they operate through that. And that provides opportunities for rights protection. So Pavel, about that.
Well, I'm not sure this is, well, this is an opportunity, of course, but I'm not saying that this was our choice because we were. I would prefer to work in a more democratic and rule of law society with working institutions, but
Rotation of power.
yes, and rotation of power. But what was there, we just used the opportunities that we had. So yes, Russia is a very legalistic country. All bad things are being made under the flag of the law, and Putin was uh, Putin actually announced this concept of dictatorship of law in his early first years of in power. It's like in opposition to the rule of law, we got this dictatorship of law. But what is interesting about this, and that's why actually he stepped down after the second term in 2008, because that's what Constitution required from him. So he didn't just ignore the Constitution, and this is also a sign of the power of Constitution and the power of legal norms in it. But the good thing for us lawyers was that we managed to do good strategic litigation in this system, because the vertical powers, if you are successful and good enough to bring certain issue on the top in the highest court, for example, whether this is a Supreme Court or Constitutional Court, and it improves the situation of a certain kind, it immediately changes all over the country because everybody is subordinate, and there is no opposition and resistance to change if these changes are going from above. So that's why we managed to win multiple cases in the Russian Constitutional Court. But it matters what the topic is. It cannot be very politically sensitive. It cannot be about political opposition parties, elections. It cannot be, I don't know, topics like LGBT rights or some those topics that are used by the federal government to influence and to which are seen as political. But when it comes to some issues like social, uh, uh, economic, or I don't know, medical, or something like this, the social rights approach, you can do, we could do a lot in terms of improvements and changes, but not in the military state which Russia turned to be after the full-scale invasion in 2022. So that was a significant structural change in our work. We couldn't do any strategically. I was the policy. Our corporate policy was that we are not the service providers. We are lawyers changing the situation in a whole. We use our clients in their cases as a vehicle to lead us to certain improvements of the whole situation in the country. That's why we use widely the European Court of Human Rights and work between the highest courts and the European Court of Human Rights. We've had thousands of cases in the Strasbourg court, but later, when the war started, the only thing human rights lawyers can do is trying to help or assist particular people facing repressions and trying to diminish the consequences for them, trying to drag them out from the jail provide certain humanitarian assistance, negotiate with the law enforcement, and something like that.
So we talked about. I mean, there's some of you may know Ernst Frankel's book, The Dual State, which is this is written. Ernst Frankel was a lawyer in Germany, in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and he actually titles his book the after the colon. It's a theory of dictatorship, is what he calls it. But that dualism is present, right? It's present in Russia from even as Putin is asserting control. And the way that Frankel describes it is, this duality between, on one hand, a normative state where, as Pavel was saying, you can go into court and actually win against the state, right? You can actually win cases against the Department of Justice or whatever. You can win. You can actually win cases, and there's you're going to get judges who are going to actually try to follow the law in certain cases that are not politically sensitive. But when as we described, when the eye of the center, the eye of Sauron is on the case, right? When the focus is on that, and we can talk about one example that's quite early in this period, the trial of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who is the oligarch who ultimately spends 11 years in prison. The way that they manipulate and essentially suspend the rules of legal procedure in that case is pretty remarkable. Right. And it's, again, because the eye was on this and the judges knew that they were under pressure and they were getting, whether it's, the old Soviet idea of telephone justice, they probably were getting some telephone calls, or they just knew they had to do the right thing. And of course, that legacy lived on. If anyone followed the Navalny prosecution, it's same thing, all kinds of irregularities, misuse of law. But at the same time, this is one of the complexities of law and authoritarian regimes. In other parts, in other less politicized areas, you can see law operating, right? And this is one of the things that for Pavel, this is no surprise. He's been working in this for a while. But one of the things, when I said at the beginning, the misconceptions and misunderstandings we have of new authoritarian regimes like Russia is we think, well, because there's the suspension of law in these political cases, that means law doesn't matter at all, and that's not true, right? Law does matter, and in fact, as Pavel told me, you said, as each year went on and Putin dominated more and more, there was more demand for lawyers, right? Lawyers, your group, the group that Pavel founded, the Agora group. Can you tell the story about how you built that? Where did the funding come from for a lot of the legal education for your group?
Well, initially, like most human rights NGOs around the world, we were getting some funding from private foundations, mostly foreign ones that were based in the West, or governmental money coming from the European Union or the United States government. But in 2012, the Russian government adopted the foreign agent law, and was clear understanding that it was against human rights organizations, first of all. And at the same time, the Kremlin decided to open a grant competition for the federal money, for non-governmental organizations working in human rights. And I had that immediate feeling that, well, if we applied, we would get the money. And we decided to ask the money for human rights education of lawyers, and we got it. So we were training Russian lawyers, human rights tactics and practices on the Kremlin's money, and we invited lawyers from Europe. One of our team members later became the judge to the European Court of Human Rights from Bulgaria. So he was coming to Russia, training Russian lawyers and getting Putin's money, and he was happy about that because at least some money doing some good work for Russian human rights. And that's actually before that we were like a team of 15 lawyers. Later we became a team of 300 lawyers, and that was thanks to a certain extent, the federal money and the presidential administration that distributed that money among organizations.
So I think it's, I mean, just, that story I think is a really interesting one to think about when the complexities of these systems, right? And trying to understand as lawyers how law operates, where it operates, and trying to be able to keep two ideas in your head. On one hand, law can be suspended, right? When the center, when the presidential administration, when the office of the president and Putin himself wants something done, it will happen, no matter what the law says. But on the other hand, a lot of other cases necessarily, they go and there's action. There's quite a bit going on in those areas where the normative kind of legal arguments matter. Training matters.
Moreover, I was a member of the Presidential Council of Human Rights for 7 years, since 2012, and my organization was registered as a foreign agent in 2014. So at the same time, Agora was in the foreign agent list, and I was sitting in the Presidential Council, meeting Putin every year, and even more frequently, the chief of his administration that time. And it lasts, I mean, this dualism or, I don't know, schizophrenia was all the time because Putin was, well, he is a master of deception. That's clearly, he managed to deceive the West many times for too long, until, we all understand who the real person is behind.
And he's also a lawyer himself, and he knows. I mean, one of the reasons, there's a reason. The Putin himself and the people around him are smart enough to know that they need the Constitution and rules and these types of frameworks in place to ensure coordination. I mean, Russia's 140 million people. Russia's 10 time zones. It's huge. How could you possibly rule? Sometimes you see this very cartoonish idea that that everything is decided by Putin himself. Like, obviously, the man is not superhuman. As much as he would like to portray that through the media and so forth, he's not deciding it. And they understand that they need this. So this duality of authoritarianism, which even remains today, right? In a smaller, and obviously the normative state, the kind of the cases that are actually decided in line with the law are reducing, right, in size, but still, they still exist. They have to exist, right? And I think in all, so it's a broader lesson from this Russian story that we're telling, and that Pavel's giving us kind of insight into, which is across all authoritarian regimes, there are generally some form of, there are often good lawyers trying to do the right thing, and often good judges trying to do the right thing as well. And it's important for us to understand that when we think about, there's no rule of law. Well, okay, yeah, rule of law is not applied, across the case to all cases, but in some cases it's applied. I want to ask you now about, you mentioned international human rights law and the European Court of Human Rights in particular. What was your experience of, because of course Russia cedes to the European Court of Human Rights to the Council of Europe in 1997, I think. Is it 97?
It became a member of the Council of Europe in 96, and took the jurisdiction of the court in 98.
98, okay. What was your experience of the impact of a transnational court like the European Court of Human Rights on a country like Russia, which at that stage, in say in the early 2000s, is slowly becoming more and more authoritarian over time? What was the impact? Was it positive, negative, how, or not at all? Like, obviously there's a lot of people who just throw up their arms and say these things don't matter. What was your perception, like, on the ground as someone? How did it impact your life as a lawyer and change the legal kind of setup?
We started working with the European Court, I think, in 2010, 2011. It's pretty late because our initial concept was that there was a number of human rights groups already working with the Strasbourg court, but our focus actually was to reach success on the national level. And that was our main focus, showing exactly that you were just saying. It was possible to win the case and to get the success on the national level. But then we eventually started working with the European Court, and some. Well, there were tens of tens of thousands of applicants from Russia receiving judgments and compensations throughout 2.5 decades.
Because if you look at the numbers, I think Russia was the most applicants of any country. Well, I guess it's 100 million population.
With Turkey probably competing with Turkey for the numbers. But I should also say that European Court was an inspiration for the whole generation of human rights lawyers in Russia. There are hundreds of lawyers who were reading the judgments, who were drafting applications, who were writing these written observations to the government position. So it's like the institution where the best lawyers are meeting each other, one's from the society and from human rights perspective, another from the government and the judges from all over the Europe. And it can be seen like all Europe is one legal sphere and space on certain issues related to basic civil rights like freedom of expression, ban on tortures, etc. So that was for the first time when Russian legal system was a part of an international one concerning human rights. That was the peak of human rights movement started by Andrei Sakharov.
A legacy that we can see continuing through, right? Which is wanting to use the Constitution. This is something that's quite common in Europe, using the Constitution to open the legal system to international law and the international courts, right? And that's in this case the European Court of Human Rights. And you're saying so it's improving kind of professionalism of because lawyers are seeing this and it's something that I've seen as well in my time in Russia. The demand for law is huge, right? The number of Russians are some of the most litigious. When there's a lot of discussions of legal nihilism and so forth, it's generally not a reflection of the fact that people don't want to bring claims and they're not, they want to make dispute. They want to dispute things. They're going to sue the state. They're going to try to protect their rights and so forth. And there's demand for these things, right? So it becomes, quite an important part of this, complex story. Obviously, a story that is that tells us a lot about, the world as well. All right, I want to turn to the next slide, and this is a road in near Yaroslavl in Russia. It actually is real. I thought this was fake when I first saw this. I checked, make sure there's actually a video of someone I don't know. I guess it could be AI or something, but I've pretty good. This is real. But the point of this slide is to talk about and this is something that like when we think about legal and constitutional ordering. When we've talked a lot about, in the 90s, there was a need for a crisis, kind of solution, right? Things were looking like they could further collapse, state collapse. No one wants anarchy, and so forth. But over time, centralization of authority leads to the domination of one person, generally not just one person. Often what we see in highly centralized constitutional systems is that one person often allies, generally him, the strong man, allies himself with powerful economic oligarchs. That's very much the story in Russia. Potentially could be the story we're seeing in the United States a little bit, right? The alliance between the current president and Elon Musk and others. So, powerful interests kind of coming together. And what impacts does that generally have? Now, these strongman systems claim, right, to be able to deliver. Right, one of the claims that they make with respect to service delivery. We're getting stuff done. Just trust the center. The center will do it. And we've already mentioned something that Pavel and I have talked to in the couple conversations we've had. The way to think about this is to think about the center. These kind of centralized system. It's almost like if those of you who've read Lord of the Rings, the eye of Sauron. When the eye is on something, it can be solved, and it will be solved. Sometimes not always the best way, because they may not be getting the best information, but they will focus on it, right? It's able to focus. But when the eye is not on something, it it is not, things are not done very well because, of course, and we see this very much in the regions, and roads, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit more about Alexei Navalny and his movement in a moment about what that can teach us about how to counter these types of centralized strongman claims. But one of them is to say that they just don't deliver on basic goods, right? Roads. So Alexei Navalny set up this Rasiyama, which is essentially just saying, look, you've got a big old hole in the road and no one's doing anything about it. Right. And it was a way of trying to point out the dysfunctionality at the center of these centralized systems, and that, they can maybe muddle through by constantly putting the eye on the next big issue or what's happening. But overall, systematically, it does not deliver at all effectively. And this is something that, I think we should keep in mind when we think about it, and something that Russia shows us, because Russia is probably one of the most extreme versions of centralization we can see in the world, and one of the longest versions. It's been centralized for quite a long time in this context. So, Pavel, just your thoughts on that and how you encountered that as a lawyer. And
I will give you one example of our recent work. The case there are street musicians in St. Petersburg playing some songs on the streets. They very young, like 18 years old, a band of three, singer, guitar player, and drum player. They were playing also the songs of the band singers that are in exile because of the war ongoing. They are all in the foreign agent list. They were prohibited to play to make tours in Russia, inside the country. So these street musicians were playing these songs on the streets in St. Petersburg. They were arrested for the first time in August, I think. I was consulting them. I warned them that if they continue doing that, it's going to be bigger trouble for them. When you talk to these teenagers, they never listen, right? I have my son. He'll be 22 soon in a couple of days, so I know that pretty well. They definitely continue. They've been arrested. They spent 2 weeks in jail. It was an administrative arrest, not a criminal case. But they were told that they have to go to the front line or to the military hospital and to sing for Russian soldiers coming from Ukraine. They refused to. Then they were put under administrative arrest for another 2 weeks. That just happened in October and November. And all of a sudden, we found out our lawyers were representing all three of them. And all of a sudden, we realized, and we were told that that was a presidential administration dealing with the case. And it was Moscow and the Kremlin administration dealing with it was not even a criminal case. It was just, like thousands of administrative cases all around the country, but they were dealing, and the member of the parliament, the federal parliament, was negotiating with the mother of the singer, with the lawyer, inviting lawyer to talk, and they were pushing them to agree to make these songs, singing for the Russian soldiers, threatening them with the criminal case and the longer term in Russian jail. And that was exactly the thing that I'm not an insider, by the way, anymore, because I don't live in Russia. I live in Prague. So I was sitting in Prague, coordinating the work of our lawyers in St. Petersburg, and on the other hand, on that negotiating process was the Kremlin administration trying to persuade these young teenagers to show this loyalty to the authorities and to do these bad things that they're. And our idea, and that was exactly this Sauron eye on the case, hopefully not on us, but on the case, and they clearly understand whose lawyers were working. That was Agora lawyers, etc. So our tactics was to uh, to get the case low and to take it out from the public, although all media were writing about every step of these musicians for the whole month. Our idea was to get it out from the Sauron eye for at least for a few days. That would allow us to get them out from prison and to get them out from the country. That's exactly what happened. So immediately after the Sauron eye was distracted for on something else, for example, the Trump peace plan, right? Hopefully, thanks God that the street musicians were released, and now they are 2 days out from the country, and we are dealing with their documents, hope to drag them to Europe for better life. So that's an example how things are being done currently in Russia.
And I mean, we could talk more in the Q&A if you'd like. We can think about this idea of the centralized Sauron's eye. You can see that in other countries, even including in advanced industrial democracies like the United States. When the eye of Trump is on something, he's focused on it, but then when it flicks away, nothing much happens on that, or particularly in foreign policy stuff. So, it's this is a kind of, I think, an important kind of overarching thing that we see across these types of systems, and Russia really shows us some of the impacts of it, and it obviously has impacts on people's everyday lives and the actual delivery of services. I want to get to Q&A, so I'm going to skip to this one, because Pavel and I wanted to finish on something that's a little more, a lot of this is quite dark, but think about what I'm calling and what is some form of counter-authoritarian learning, right? So we'll finish with this and then we'll open it for Q&A. And this is that, we're thinking of lessons from Russia. What does Russia teach us? Russia shows us a lot of the dark arts, as I call it, the dark arts of authoritarian control, how to dominate, how to appear democratic, because you're winning quote unquote elections. But of course, these elections are largely, used, they're kind of rigged in certain ways, so using administrative resources and institutions like courts are co-opted and so forth. So there's a lot of, problematic aspects of this. And these types of mechanisms are spreading around the world, right? This is a picture from India, where India recent, I think it was within the last year or so, has adopted a kind of foreign agent law, very much modeled on the Russian one. Right? So there's learning going on between like new authoritarian leaders. I mean, Prabowo in Indonesia is another example who's clearly learning from and studying what's happened in Russia and other parts of the world. So there's a negative aspect of this learning, but there's also a more positive aspect, which is a counter-authoritarian learning process. And this is something that Pavel now is very involved in his work. This is his work outside of Russia, I guess, right? Which is actually going and saying, look, Pavel's been dealing with these mechanisms, these tactics, these foreign agent laws for a long time. He knows how to circumvent and so forth. So there's actually forms of countering these forms of by going and learning from each other in terms of how do you continue to do human rights work as this situation gets harder, as regulations and the state tries to impose these regulations. So you want to talk a little bit about that work, and India is one where you've been recently.
Well, I'm not going to open you all the life hacks we're using because sometimes it's not it doesn't very comply with the national legislation. And we lawyers know how, we're not doing anything illegal, but still, we managed to work. And talking about Russia, we still have about 150 lawyers working on about 1,500 ongoing cases right now. There are 50 new cases coming every month. Most of them are criminal cases. So these are criminal defense lawyers and these are cases on terrorism, on treason, on very hard, very risky cases to work on because the feds are watching who is working, what the results are, etc., etc. But we still managed to squeeze some funds on the ground. We still managed to communicate securely, etc., etc. And this expertise that we've been gaining or accumulating for, I don't know, 15 years now, suddenly is on demand from in many other places of the world because these repressive and authoritarian instruments and means are being used more and more by more and more governments,
including the U.S., right? People need,
including U.S. and during last year, I was consulting NGOs in India, in Israel, in Uganda, in Nigeria, in Peru, and even in Hungary, and even in the United States, because we even have a community foundation from the United States, which decided to transfer money to our organization in Europe, just to park it for some time, because who knows what should be expected from Trump, etc., because he was threatening a lot of civil society groups in the United States. So this is exactly, and I also noticed that these techniques that we are using, they are effective in other places. There was a meeting in which the guy from India, the human rights lawyer from not from India, the human rights lawyer from Egypt was present along with me, and there were other guys from other places, and they were talking about the problems that of getting funds from outside on the ground, and it was funny. It was funny how the Egyptian and the Russian guy, me, were talking on the same page all the time. So I was starting a sentence, and he was finishing, and he explained the system, how they work. Like one person is in Egypt and never travels abroad. One person is in Switzerland and never goes to Egypt, and the third one is traveling in between, and all the money are accumulated in their legal entity in Switzerland, which is outside in the safe jurisdiction, let's say, and then they manage to transfer money to Egypt and maintain the work of their human rights lawyers network. And that were for Indians, that was something that they've never thought even, because their mind is very like how to say comply with the law. If the law says you cannot do that, normal Indian wouldn't do that because it's prohibited. But normal Russian would definitely go around immediately. If this is not allowed, well, we should find a way. That's a different approach. And I notice how more and more demand is of these kind of techniques that we are using. So we are, I don't know. When I was in Nigeria, for example, have some of you been in Nigeria ever? So I booked an apartment for us for a couple of nights in Lagos, I think it was, and we had troubles to pay it because the owner didn't want to come, and he asked to transfer money, and we couldn't transfer with our European accounts on the Nigerian bank. And then I said, probably crypto. He said, yes, definitely crypto. And then when we made a Nigerian report on the situation with NGOs in the country, we noticed that the head of the central bank in Nigeria said that more Nigerians have their cryptocurrency wallets than they have bank accounts. And Nigeria is like 250 million people, and the huge society, and they are widely using cryptocurrency. And this is one of the tools that human rights NGOs are actively using now in the authoritarian countries. So, and this is what we are teaching our lawyers how to, and not only in Russia but also now in other places of the world, how to use that. And this is everything is legal. I mean, not illegal stuff.
Yeah, right. All right.
5 past the hour, so I guess that's time to wrap up. Join me in thanking Pavel and Will